If you give away your very last silver dollar to a stranger, do you lose everything, or receive something worth more than gold? The morning sun hung 2 fingers above the eastern ridge when Thomas Garrett counted his money for the 3rd time. 37 cents and a silver dollar, the last of his father's legacy, worn smooth by 2 generations of thumbs. He tucked the coins back into his vest pocket and stepped from the cabin threshold, boots scuffing the packed earth of his yard. The drought had lasted 4 months. His well held water, but barely. The vegetable patch behind the house showed brown stalks where green beans should have climbed. Even the chickens seemed listless, pecking at dust instead of seed. In town, Main Street baked under the late morning heat. Thomas hitched his mare to the post outside Brennan's general store and pushed through the door, the bell overhead giving a tired chime. The smell of coffee beans and lamp oil filled the narrow space between shelves stocked thin with goods. "Morning, Thomas." Brennan looked up from his ledger, pencil poised. "What brings you in?" "Need to settle my account before I buy anything new." Thomas pulled the coins from his pocket, the silver dollar catching lamplight. "How much do I owe?" Brennan flipped back through pages. "Comes to $8.15. Flour, salt, and that harness repair from June." Thomas set the dollar on the counter. "I can give you this now, and I'll bring the rest next week when I sell the heifer." "That'll do." Brennan's hand hovered over the coin but didn't take it. "You sure about this? That's eating money right there." Before Thomas could answer, voices rose from the street outside. Through the window, he saw a crowd gathered near the courthouse steps. A man in a threadbare coat stood between 2 others, one wearing a deputy's badge, the other in a black suit that marked him as either preacher or lawyer. "What's the trouble?" Thomas asked. Brennan shook his head. "Mexican fellow, name of Esperanza, owes the county $12 in back taxes on that quarter section south of here. Judge says pay up or lose the land." Thomas watched through the glass as the man in the threadbare coat turned his hat in his hands, speaking rapidly in Spanish, to a woman who stood nearby holding a small child. The woman's face showed the particular strain of someone calculating disasters. $12, Thomas repeated. Judge gave him till sundown to raise it. Otherwise, the land goes to auction tomorrow. Brennan finally took the silver dollar and dropped it into his cash box. Shame, really. Fellow's got good ground there, just needs rain. Thomas walked outside. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the Mexican man still stood near the courthouse, his family clustered around him like birds in a storm. The deputy sheriff adjusted his gun belt and headed back toward his office. "Señor Esperanza," Thomas called. The man turned. Up close, Thomas could see he was younger than his worry, made him appear maybe 30, with calloused hands and the particular squint of someone who spent days watching the horizon for weather. "You speak English?" Thomas asked. "Yes, señor." "Some." Thomas pulled his remaining coins from his pocket, 37 cents in small silver and copper. Not nearly enough. He looked at the man's wife, at the child who clung to her skirts, then back at Esperanza's face. "Wait here," he said. He returned to Brennan's store. The storekeeper was rearranging items on a shelf, moving the same tin of peaches from one spot to another. "Sam, I need that dollar back." Brennan paused. "Your account, I'll settle it next week with the rest." Brennan retrieved the coin and placed it on the counter. Thomas picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, then walked back outside to where Esperanza waited. "This won't cover it all," Thomas said, holding out the dollar and his smaller coins. "But maybe it helps." Esperanza stared at the money. "Señor, I cannot— You can't lose your land." Thomas pressed the coins into the man's palm. "Not over $12. The woman said something in Spanish. Esperanza nodded and looked back at Thomas. "My wife asks why you help us. We don't know you." Thomas glanced toward the courthouse, where the flag hung limp in the still air. "Because $12 shouldn't cost a man his home." He turned to leave, but Esperanza caught his arm. "Your name, senor?" "Thomas Garrett. I live north of town, near Willow Creek. I will remember." Thomas untied his mare and rode home with empty pockets, the sun climbing toward its noon position. Behind him he heard voices gathering again near the courthouse, Esperanza and others, working through the arithmetic of survival. That evening, as shadows stretched long across his yard, Thomas sat on his porch and watched the western sky turn orange. Somewhere in town, a family would sleep tonight, knowing they still had land under their feet. It seemed a dear price for a small salvation, and still a bargain. He ate nothing. Twice he rose to rattle the coop latch he'd checked already, counting hens the way a man counts reasons. By lantern light he counted 5 eggs and a heel of bread, then stopped counting. The well rope rasped like a dry throat when he drew water. Sleep came thin and jumpy. Really, he was counting what he had left. Not much but his name. 3 days passed. Thomas made do with the beans and cornmeal already in his cupboard, and the chickens kept laying just enough eggs to see him through. The heat continued, and the creek behind his house dropped another few inches, exposing rocks that had been under water since spring. On Thursday morning, he was mending a section of fence when he heard wagon wheels on the road. Visitors were rare enough that he set down his hammer and walked to the front gate to see who might be travelling this early. A freight wagon rounded the bend, pulled by 2 sturdy mules. The driver was a woman in a practical brown dress and a wide-brimmed hat, her sleeves rolled up against the heat. Behind her, the wagon bed was covered with canvas, but Thomas could see the corners of furniture and the round tops of barrels underneath. The woman pulled up at his gate and set the brake. "You, Thomas Garrett?" "I am." She climbed down from the wagon seat with the easy motion of someone comfortable with height and balance. "I'm Mary Hutchins. I teach at the school in town." She gestured toward the wagon. "I've got something that belongs to you." Thomas walked closer. "Ma'am, I think there's been some mistake." "I haven't ordered anything." "No mistake." She untied a corner of the canvas and pulled it back, revealing a collection of household goods. A kitchen table with turned legs, 2 chairs, a barrel that smelled of apples, another that sloshed with what might have been molasses. On top of everything sat a wooden crate filled with mason jars of preserves, peaches, green beans, tomatoes, and a cloth bundle that looked like it contained bread. "I don't understand," Thomas said. Mary Hutchins tied the canvas back in place. "Miguel Esperanza came to the school Tuesday evening. He'd heard I was collecting donations for the Whitman family. They lost their house in that fire last month. Miguel wanted to contribute something, but he didn't have money." She paused and looked at Thomas directly. "He told me about Monday, about what you did at the courthouse." Thomas felt heat rise in his face. That wasn't anything special. Miguel thought it was. Mary continued. "He spent 2 days talking to everyone he could find at the church, at the depot, at every farm between here and town. Told them about the man who gave his last dollar to save a stranger's land." The weight of what she was saying began to settle on Thomas like dust after a wind. "Ma'am, by Wednesday night he had this whole wagon full of donations. Not for the Whitmans, mind you, for you." She gestured toward the covered goods. Mrs. Patterson sent the preserves. The Kowalskis contributed the table and chairs, their son's a furniture maker in Denver. The apple barrel came from the Henderson's orchard. That's molasses from the Schmidt sorghum mill. Thomas walked around to the back of the wagon, looking at the canvas covering. Underneath was easily $50 worth of goods, maybe more. "I can't accept this," he said. "Try telling that to Miguel Esperanza." Mary's voice carried a hint of amusement. "He said a man who'd give away his last dollar to help a stranger deserved to have friends looking out for him." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in the climbing heat. Thomas watched it for a moment, thinking about the arithmetic of kindness, how a dollar given could return as a wagon full of provisions, how generosity seemed to multiply in ways that made no sense on paper. "There's one more thing," Mary said. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out an envelope. This came with everything else. Thomas took the envelope. His name was written on the front in careful script. Inside was a sheet of paper with 2 lines in the same handwriting. "Signor Garrett, a man's character is measured not by what he keeps, but by what he gives away when he has nothing left to give. Your friend, Miguel Esperanza." Below that, in different handwriting, "The land is saved. We plant beans next spring. Come see the harvest." Thomas folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. When he looked up, Mary Hutchins was studying him with the particular attention teachers reserved for students who might finally be learning something important. "Well," she said, "are you going to help me unload this wagon, or do I have to carry everything myself?" By afternoon, Thomas's cabin looked like a different place. The kitchen table sat square in the center of the main room, sturdy enough to write letters or eat proper meals instead of standing at the counter with a tin plate. The chairs matched each other, and the table, crafted from oak that still smelled faintly of the varnish used to finish them. Mary Hutchins had stayed to help arrange everything, directing the placement of furniture with the same authority she probably used to organize school pageants. The preserves lined one shelf of his cupboard, bright jars that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "The molasses will keep through winter," she said, checking the seal on the barrel, "and those apples are good for sauce or drying, if you know how." Thomas nodded, though he'd never made applesauce in his life. "I'll figure it out. I could show you." The words came out quickly, as if she'd been holding them back. "I mean, if you wanted to learn, I preserve things every fall for the school we feed lunch, to the children whose families can't afford to send them home at midday." She paused by the window, looking out toward the road. "Miguel told me you live alone out here. Said you lost your father last spring." "Yes, Mom. He had lung fever." "That's hard." Her voice carried the tone of someone who'd comforted bereaved children. "My husband died 3 years ago. Influenza. It's different, being alone in a place that used to hold 2 people." Thomas set the last jar of preserves on the shelf. Through the window, he could see his mare in the pasture, head down in what shade the fence post provided. The heat was building toward its daily peak, and even with both windows open, the cabin felt close. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked. "Or water from the well?" Water would be fine. He drew a bucket from the well and poured 2 cups, handing one to Mary. They sat at the new table. The first time Thomas had sat down to drink anything in his own house since his father's funeral. "The school keeps you busy, I imagine," he said. 23 children this year, ages 6 to 14. We're hoping to add a few more when the harvest is finished." She sipped her water and looked around the room. "This is a good place. Quiet enough for thinking, close enough to town for company when you want it." Through the window, Thomas saw dust rising from the south road. A rider was coming at a steady pace, not hurried but not dawdling either. As the horse drew closer, he recognized the bay gelding that belonged to Deputy Marshal Crawford. "Expecting company?" Mary asked. "No." Crawford pulled up at the gate and dismounted. looping his reins over the fence post. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the particular way of moving that came from years of watching for trouble. His badge caught the light as he walked toward the house. Thomas met him at the door. "Afternoon, Marshal. What brings you out this way?" "Got a question for you, Thomas." Crawford nodded toward Mary. "Ma'am, Deputy Marshal Crawford. This is Mary Hutchins. She teaches school in town." Crawford touched his hat brim. "Pleasure, ma'am." He turned back to Thomas. "You know a Mexican fellow named Miguel Esperanza?" Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "I've met him." "Why?" "He came to see Judge Morrison this morning. Brought 11 other men with him, all property owners, all taxpayers. They want to form a mutual aid society. I don't follow." Crawford pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "They're proposing to pool money for emergencies. If one member can't make his tax payment or loses crops to weather, the others contribute to help him through. They want it recognized as a legal association, with articles of incorporation and everything." Thomas took the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful and formal, though some of the English showed the careful construction of someone thinking in another language first. "Esperanza said the idea came from watching what happened Monday at the courthouse," Crawford continued. "Said he figured if one stranger could help another, neighbors ought to be helping neighbors as a matter of course." Mary leaned forward. "What did the judge say?" "Said it was the smartest thing he'd heard all year. Signed the papers this afternoon." Crawford grinned. "Esperanza asked me to ride out and tell you. Said you were the first member, whether you knew it or not." Thomas read through the document. The language was formal, but the idea was simple. 12 families contributing $2 each per year into a common fund, available for emergencies, administered by elected trustees, with decisions made by majority vote. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "Didn't have to." Crawford took the paper back and folded it. "Most good notions start when a man does the right thing before he's counted the cost." After Crawford left, Thomas and Mary sat at the table while the afternoon heat pressed against the windows. The silence felt comfortable rather than empty, the kind of quiet that comes between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. "You realize what you've started," Mary said finally. "I gave a man $1.37. You gave a stranger hope when you had nothing left to give." She stood and smoothed her skirts. "That's not the same thing at all." Sunday morning brought the sound of wagons on the road, not one or two, but a steady procession that made Thomas step outside to see what was happening. He counted 5 wagons and twice as many people on horseback, all heading in the direction of town. Mary Hutchins had mentioned the night before that there would be a special service at the church, something about celebrating community partnerships. Thomas had nodded politely but hadn't planned to attend. He'd never been comfortable in crowds, especially when the attention might turn his way. But the sound of so many people moving together pulled at something in him. He found himself washing his face and putting on his good shirt, the blue one his father had worn to church before the lung fever, and saddling his mare. The church sat on a rise north of Main Street, a simple wooden building with a bell tower and windows that caught the morning light. By the time Thomas arrived, the hitching posts were full, and wagons lined the road in both directions. He tied his mare and went in. Miguel Esperanza met him at the church steps. The Mexican man looked different than he had at the courthouse cleaner, more confident, wearing a vest that someone had mended with careful stitches. "Senor Garrett." Miguel extended his hand. "I hoped you would come." "Miguel." Thomas shook the offered hand. "I hear congratulations are in order. The Mutual Aid Society. See, But that is not why we gather today. Miguel gestured toward the church doors. Today we celebrate something else. Inside, the pews were packed. Thomas recognized faces from town shopkeepers and farmers, the blacksmith and his wife, families he'd seen but never spoken to. Near the front, Mary Hutchins sat with several children who must have been her students. She turned and smiled when she saw him enter. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, but before he could begin, Miguel Esperanza walked to the front of the church. The congregation fell quiet. Miguel did not preach. He stepped to the front with a folded paper and a pencil worn half its length. He raised them so the whole room could see. "Names," he said. The congregation stirred. One by one, men and women rose. Henderson came first, mill oil still black in the lines of his palms. Mrs. Patterson followed, her dress carrying the faint scent of peaches. The blacksmith pressed his thumbprint beside his name, the skin split by a fresh cut. Each sound marked the moment, the scratch of graphite, the creak of pews, the hush that filled the gaps. Children leaned forward to watch. A girl passed the pencil back with both hands, as if it were a relic. A boy whispered the letters aloud while his father signed. Dust floated in the slanted light from the windows, turning the air golden, solemn. When the last hand withdrew, Pastor Williams lifted the page and held it so Thomas could see the crooked columns of signatures, some neat, some barely more than marks. Miguel searched for words. His English faltered, then steadied. Equal shares, equal work, equal risk. He looked across the room, found Thomas in the back pew. Neighbours. Pastor Williams set the paper on the pulpit. "This is your agreement, Thomas, signed by 12 families, shared tools, shared labour, shared harvest. A beginning." "I don't understand," Thomas said. "You barely know me." "We know enough," said a voice from the congregation. Thomas turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the woman who'd contributed the preserves. "We know you gave away your last dollar to help a stranger. We know you didn't ask for anything in return. We know you're the kind of man we want for a neighbour." Mary Hutchins rose from her pew. "There's one more thing." She walked to the front and stood beside Thomas. "The school board met yesterday. They've approved funding for a new teacher's cottage to be built on donated land. They've asked me to oversee the project." She paused and looked at Thomas. "The land they chose is the 5-acre plot adjacent to your property. If you're agreeable, we'll be neighbours." Thomas looked at the document in his hands, then at the faces surrounding him, Miguel Esperanza and his wife, the Kowalskis and the Hendersons, Mary Hutchins with her steady teacher's gaze, and beyond them, a church full of people who'd somehow decided he belonged among them. 6 days ago, he'd owned 37 cents and a silver dollar. Now he held partnership papers worth more than his father's entire legacy. And the promise of neighbours who'd chosen to trust him based on a single act of generosity. "I accept," he said. The church erupted in applause. Miguel Esperanza embraced him, and Mary Hutchins smiled in a way that suggested she'd known all along how this would end. 2 months later, Thomas woke to the sound of hammers and saws. Through his bedroom window, he could see the frame of Mary's cottage taking shape, the walls rising square and true under the direction of the Kowalski boy who'd learned carpentry better than anyone expected. He dressed and walked outside to find Miguel Esperanza measuring fence posts in his yard. "Morning, Miguel." "Good morning, Thomas. The boundary fence is nearly finished. By next week, you can turn your horses into the common pasture with ours." Thomas poured coffee from the pot he'd left warming on the stove and carried 2 cups outside. They sat at the kitchen table now positioned on his front porch, where it caught the morning breeze and provided a view of both the cottage construction and the road to town. "Any regrets?" Miguel asked. Thomas considered the question. His savings account now held $43, his share of the cooperative's first successful harvest, his cupboards were full of food contributed by neighbours, his well-supplied water to 3 families during the dry spell, and in return he'd learned to preserve apples and canned vegetables from Mary Hutchins. Most importantly, his mailbox bore not just his name, but the addresses of 11 other families who decided that mutual aid was better than individual struggle. "No regrets," he said. A wagon was coming up the road from town, the mail delivery that now stopped at all 12 properties in the cooperative. Thomas recognized the driver, a young man whose route had expanded to accommodate their new partnership. The driver pulled up at the gate and handed Thomas a bundle of letters. "Morning, Thomas. Got mail for the Esperanzas and the Kowalskis, too. I'll see they get it." After the wagon continued down the road, Thomas sorted through the letters. Most were business correspondence for the cooperative, but one envelope caught his attention. It was addressed to him personally, with a return address from Denver. Inside was a brief note from a furniture maker named David Kowalski. "Mr. Garrett, my parents wrote to tell me about your mutual aid society. I'm interested in expanding my business to include mail order sales. Would your cooperative consider partnering with me to distribute furniture throughout rural Colorado? I can offer favorable terms to groups committed to community support." Thomas folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. Around him, the sounds of construction continued, hammers and saws, building not just a cottage, but a visible sign that neighbours had decided to stay close to each other. Miguel finished his measurements and stood up. "My wife wants to know if you'll join us for dinner Sunday. She's making tamales. I'd like that." After Miguel left, Thomas sat alone on his porch and watched Mary Hutchins direct the placement of window frames in her cottage. The work was careful and thorough, built to last through seasons and storms. He thought about the silver dollar he'd given away 2 months ago, how it had travelled from his hand to Miguel's, then to the county courthouse, then somehow transformed into all of this. Partnerships and friendships, mutual aid and shared prosperity, a community that had grown around a simple act of kindness. It seemed impossible that so much could come from so little. But then again, the best things often did. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.